Good morning all, and you're very welcome to Teagasc Hedgerow Week 2021. My name is Katherine Keena, Teagasc Countryside Management Specialist, and this is the third year of Teagasc Hedgerow Week. Last year we were forced to go virtual, and the positive side of this was it resulted in a bank of material with experts, video clips and joint articles on almost every aspect of Irish hedges. So this year we decided to build on that and discuss the topics and materials that arose within panel discussions. Today the topic is food from hedges, and our panel is Regina Sexton, a food and culinary historian, who's also the programme manager of the postgraduate diploma in Irish food culture in UCC. We have Rosemarie Cusack, who's a cookery demonstrator, and Mary White from Blackstairs Eco Trails. Good morning all.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hello Regina. Hello. Hello Rosemary, and hello Mary.
Hello everybody.
We are starting today with Regina, who's going to give us a presentation. So we'll hand over to you now, Regina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine, and good morning, everybody. I see there's a good number of people joining us, so that's great. And thank you for the invite to come and speak to you today. I know it's been rather difficult for the last year or so putting events online, but hopefully we can think about other ways to bring everything back to the field, hopefully not too long into the future. So what I'm going to do this morning is I just have a handful of slides. I'm not going to speak for too long at all. I'm just going to introduce kind of very general ideas around wild food and maybe introduce some ways that we can think about wild food, particularly from a heritage perspective. I have to say, I was just out myself this morning in my own garden, and because the weather is relatively mild, I was able to pick up a little bit of wild wood sorrel, which is growing abundantly in my garden. So there are little things out there still. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and as I say, the presentation is very short. It's very general. And it's deliberately so because we can possibly come back and take questions when all the other speakers have presented to you. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and we'll go through a few of the slides. So as Katherine said, I'm a food and culinary historian, and I work in UCC, and I've been looking at, I suppose, Irish food from a historical perspective and how it's cooked since the early 1990s. And within that time, I find it really interesting, between the 90s, I suppose, when I was starting out and up to a present day context, I find it really interesting to see how people are starting to think about wild food in different ways, and also, of course, bringing it into the kitchen, be it a domestic kitchen or restaurant kitchens, to cook that food and what that actually means. So I'm really interested in how all of this has come about, and possibly why it's come about. And we all have some connection, I think, with wild food. The lovely images I'm showing you are wild apples, and there down at the bottom on the left-hand side, for my screen anyway, is wood sorrel in flower. And actually my wood sorrel in the garden is actually going to flower as well. I was looking at it earlier this morning. And these two items, for example, are mentioned variously through time in Ireland as items of consumption. And I suppose if you look at fruit and vegetables in Ireland, and we can put wild food, particularly wild plant food, into that context, I suppose it's not as we might expect it to be. And in many ways, the products of farming and farming communities, organised, systematic production of food, obviously sort of has greater strength over foods that we might associate with wild ecosystems. If you look, for example, at the early medieval period, where I would have started my postgraduate research back in the 1990s, There are fruits and vegetables mentioned, not too many, but they're mentioned in both cultivated and wild contexts. So for example, you get references to, and these are the ones that kind of stand out in terms of the documentary strength of reference behind them. The ones that stand out would be, you know, some sort of alliums, that's the onion family, and that is variously extensive and so on. So possibly mention of an allium in the form of leeks or garlic, some sort of onion, possibly. It's very difficult actually to pin down with certainty what these cultivars actually are. But then away from the cultivars, they're the wild foods that are exploited, and you get kind of good references to these items: watercress, sorrel, and also my wood sorrel that I showed you earlier, wild garlic, of course, which is enjoying great popularity in a contemporary context, nettles, and then other cultivars, things like possibly celery, possibly chives, again coming in under the allium umbrella, possibly leek in the same context. And more unusual wild foods then, like things like brook lime and pig nut are also mentioned. Some of these are cultivated deliberately in little gardens called lubgirth, which are herb gardens. And specifically, which is interesting for us to consider, there is recognition of the medicinal values of these cultivars in treating the sick. And they're variously incorporated into things like broths with vegetables, as thickening. They're put into broths that have a base of thickening agents, possibly a cereal base. And of course, then if we move away from what I think we're concentrating on this morning, is more like woodland ecosystems or hedgerows, where you will find a lot of the items already mentioned. There is also attention to other ecosystems, and I'm thinking here of coastal ones, be it food from the sea in terms of seaweeds, or plants that are particularly associated with coastal contexts. So these are mentioned, and they're mentioned in various contexts, as I say, in terms of the documentary evidence. And for historians, I suppose, like the tool of the historian is looking at documents and placing interpretation on the documentary content. And if you look at, I suppose, where I would have started my study in the early medieval period and then see what's happening to wild food in particular through time, is that there seems to be kind of a change in the value and status that we assign to wild foods. So in the early medieval period, for example, which is very interesting for us to note, there is economic value and protection placed on some of these foods. One of the big sources for the historian in the early medieval period are what we commonly call the Brehon laws, or the group or the body of legal tracts called the Corpus Juris Hibernici. And within that context, there's actually legal provision extended to some food items of the forests, which I think is really significant because they're recognizing the value of forests, be it from what they call the nobles of the forests, would be a lot of the deciduous trees that we know today, and it moves down a hierarchy of value to some of the minor plant foods that we would associate with woodland and hedge contexts. So the fact that there's legal protection assigned to this environment says that there is a particular value on these items, be it for what they could produce, product and production, but also food value, which is really, I think, very significant. And also for us, I think, to be very proud of, that we have documentary material that in a present day context would be one of the earliest extant bodies of documentary material referring to vernacular value systems assigning to the foods of the forest and the hedgerows and so on. The other thing I suppose that this suggests to us is that if there is a recognition of the value and the diversity of product and use that can be gleaned from woodland and hedge contexts, what that suggests to us as well is that they're legally protected on the one hand, but there must also have been embedded in that culture ways of protecting and managing these environmental contexts. As we move to time, though, sort of the documentary material tends to become less I suppose, rich in terms of speaking about wild foods. And that might also connect with the fact, well, it connects to various different things, but it also could connect to the fact that as you move through time, there is changing values assigned to a lot of foods, wild foods. And sometimes you'll see, contextually speaking, that the exploitation of wild food sometimes has a connect or an association with, I suppose, those of a weaker economic standing. So there's all sorts of connections and ways of thinking about these, and that they might be associated with the food patterns and the food systems of those who are less well off. So therefore, they're not items that in terms of giving them attention, particularly documentary attention, that might be frail in that in many cases, and this is up to a present day context, those of a lesser economic standing, particularly poorer communities, failed to achieve the recognition that they should have. And particularly, I suppose, in an Irish context where the environment is largely based on agriculture and based on environment. Again, as you move through time, there is within that an incredible bank of vernacular knowledge and memory of the use and versatility of these plants, which I think we're only beginning to realize in more recent times. So that's why I find it interesting in terms of this kind of re-emergence of an interest in wild foods and their various different uses, and the kind of the identity value that we assign to that new way, rethinking these possible, for us this morning, these possible food items that we can incorporate into the diet. So if you look at the way that they're being used in present day context, if we think, for example, of one of those contexts being a restaurant context, a lot of wild foods are being incorporated into restaurant menus. I have other, I suppose, views on why that has happened and where that influence has come from. That's another discussion. But that's interesting because it gives a certain identity, I think, to restaurant menus, which we can pin back to a wider food culture. So that's also something interesting to think about. I'm just going to move through now because I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm conscious that we have a whole panel of speakers, but I'm just going to kind of show you pictures, I suppose, of items that have particular, I suppose, significance in an Irish context, not exclusively Ireland, of course. And don't forget that attention to wild foods has been given by great writers, people like Richard Nabby, which would have been one of the first sources that I looked at, Food for Free, and he was writing at a time. He was writing about what wild food at a time when it wasn't, I suppose, a fashionable thing to do. So as I say, I'm going to just show you a few images. There's an awful lot of documentary material out there for you to look at, and some of it is very good and very extensive. So we'll keep moving. Yeah, so I've mentioned all of those kind of things. So in terms of the wild foods, I suppose, kind of big players, items that have a profile in terms of heritage profile would of course be apples, both wild and cultivated. So you have wild apples and you also have crab apples. The wild version of plums in the form of sloes, for example, from the blackthorn. And you also get the cultivation of plums from the early period onwards, which they call sweet sloes. And as I said to you, these are all legally protected and so on, which is of course an intrinsic value placing on the idea of gathering food from the wild. Also, of course, big players would be things like blackberries, bilberries, hazelnuts, strawberries, hips, haws, and rowan berries. And let's not forget that also farm animals had an appetite and a fondness for wild foods, and you know, the significance of acorns, for example, as a resource for feeding and fattening pigs, called mast, historically speaking anyway. Within that sort of gathering, I suppose we'd all have some sort of knowledge of some of these wild foods like crab apples, sloes. We're familiar with those, hazelnuts, of course, strawberries, and their wild counterparts. Well, I'm talking about where we have a connection with strawberries in terms of cultivated ones. And interestingly, within that, I suppose the one that stands out for me is blackberries, because the blackberry is something that has within it holes a lot of memory, possibly nostalgia, and these two concepts sort of, even for urban populations who've moved away from rural settings or living in urban settings through time, a lot of their connection to the environment and connection to gathering and this sense of wildness would very often have been activated through relationships with blackberries. So as I say, within even urban contexts, these hold high cultural value expressed in memory and nostalgia. And we all, I think, have memories of, well, most of us anyway, have memories of collecting blackberries as children and what that actually means for us, both as a collective of people and also on a personal level. Again, other ones that stand out as being particularly significant are references to wild garlic. And again, this now has been, I suppose, inflamed as a fairly fashionable thing in more recent times. So there is a recognition of the value of particularly greens coming into the diet, accessible on the landscape from springtime. And this is one of the ones that will come out in the early years of the year, as we come from the winter into the spring months. So this is recognized as particularly important and exploited, and also integrated into various different socioeconomic systems in the early medieval period, at least. And then I just put in kind of the berries, these fellas, the blackberries. I made the biggest image on the screen, but also don't forget the importance of other items like bilberries, which are associated with particular environmental conditions like acidic soils and boglands and so on. They come online towards July into mid-July, late July, and so on. And there is great tradition as well associated with these berries and a whole sort of cultural frame around their collection and their consumption. And other items, that's really not a great image down there of a wild strawberry, which we hear mention of variously through time as well. And other things, I suppose, that would not be, that don't have a big profile in a contemporary context, things like pig nuts, which might suggest that the pigs, as a naturally foraging animal, if left to roam in the woodland, which would be its natural environment, possibly a connection with pigs and so on. But there you go, the exploitation of pig nuts here. That's what they look like under the flower that you see here on the left hand side of the screen. And then more, I suppose, unexpected ones that I highlighted initially, things like brook lime, which again we hear of being exploited in various different contexts. So I'm going to stop speaking now because I'm conscious of the fact that there are others here too. But I suppose my main point, the main point I'm making is that from a historical perspective, wild food does make an impression. That impression and the cultural significance and value of the resource varies through time. I've only just picked out a handful of items. It's not at all extensive, but that's the time constraint of this morning. And again, I suppose the interesting thing to look at is the interpretation of wild food in the past in a present day context, particularly in light of the fact that wild foods are emerging now as something interesting to think about, as I say, in general discourse and also in terms of the restaurant contexts in Ireland and further afield as well. So that's it for me for the moment. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. And I'll hand back now to Katherine.
Thank you very much, Regina. That was fascinating, and I have learned so much. I just see there's 189 at the latest people on the webinar, and I see a lot of people joining. And just to in case you missed the start, or for many others who wish to listen back to that super information, the recording it is being recorded and will be released this evening. Every night we release the recordings from today, so that will be there on the website. The second point is there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So please add comments, questions. Perhaps you have other information that we would all love to hear about your experience of food or foraging in the wild. And before I come to the video, who I'm going to ask Yvonne Maher to play in a moment, I didn't introduce Yvonne in the beginning. She's in the background and she makes everything happen here. We wouldn't have a Hedgerow week without the technology, and that's the scary bit for me, but Yvonne is doing it very well. So we are going to show, as an introduction to Rosemarie Cusack, we're going to show, she's my local expert. So last year, because I know very little about food from hedges, I wanted to know more. I understood that it was a very important way to inspire interest in hedges. So over to Yvonne to start the video. Thank you.
Hedges are full of food for birds and bees, but what about us humans? I went foraging with Cookery Demonstrator Rosemarie Cusack and Chef Paul Flynn from the Tannery Restaurant in Dungarvan, and they gave me ideas on what to do with food picked from hedges.
So I made some rose hip syrup there the other day, Paul, and actually I froze this one, and I can take it out. So when you take it out of the fridge, it only lasts for a few days really, but it's very, very pleasant, nice to taste with some ice cream or some meringues, or you can mix it with some fizzy water to drink.
I'd love to use this with game.
Oh yes.
It'd be beautiful with duck just to finish off a sauce.
Lovely.
I'm really intrigued with it. I love it. It's sweet and a little bit tart.
Yeah.
Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, and very delicate flavour too, isn't it?
This year, for the first time, I've made elderberry jelly.
Lovely.
And it's amazing. The colour is amazing. It's really easy to do. Just a little bit of stock syrup and some spice.
Fabulous.
Cinnamon. You made some
Elderflower cordial.
cordial.
Yeah, which is lovely. Just I like it with fizzy water, or sometimes a little bit of some white wine is actually quite nice as well. Yeah.
Sparkling wine as well. It's really beautiful.
Of course.
A friend of ours in Dungarvan made elderflower ice cream.
Oh, lovely.
And she's got a lovely business in Dungarvan. It was just amazing.
Fabulous.
So you see these innovations. It's a lovely thing altogether.
Yeah, yeah.
But a thing that I did during the summer as well was, the flowers themselves.
Yes.
Dip them in batter, fry them.
Beautiful.
Deep fry them. A few calories there. But
That's
really lovely with ice cream, with some of the syrup poured over the ice cream.
what a pretty thing.
Flowers fritters beside it.
Here, crab apples are really hard, sour apples, and these all fall naturally off the trees this time of the year. And of course, probably the famous thing to do is to make the crab apple jelly. Okay, so we have the blackberries, Paul, of course, which everyone loves, and I've made some blackberry mousse there, which is a nice rich colour.
What a colour! Isn't that just beautiful?
Yeah, and we have blackberry jam there as well.
Let's see.
Thank you, Yvonne. Now, if the sound was a little bit low on that video clip again is available on the website. If you just Google Teagasc food from hedges, you can listen back to it. But it was a lovely introduction, I think, Rosemarie, and to follow on from that, and thanks to Paul Flynn too for last year. So Rosemarie, that was the introduction, and I think you're going to show a few slides as well. So over to you, and thank you very much, Rosemarie.
Thanks, Katherine. Thanks, and good morning to everybody. Goodness, I didn't realise so many people would be joining. It's fantastic. Another bad hair day for myself, as well as in the video clip, so excuse all of that. So bear with me, and I'll just share my video there, and I will get my presentation up. Okay. No, there we go. Okay, so like Regina, I'm just going to do a very quick, just a very few slides here. And like, I'm very, very enthusiastic about walking down the hedgerows, and I'm very lucky and fortunate to live in the countryside. But even if you're in an urban area, we're never too far from hedges. And it's even if you're not eating from the hedge, even if you're just observing and looking, there's so much to see all times of the year. So this is my local area. This is where I walk pretty much every day. And even for myself, you can just see yourself on the right-hand side, the clipped hedge, and how boring that is, and how not good for the environment and the birds and everything, and how much more interesting the hedge is on the left hand side there. And that's where I'd be looking constantly. I mean, when I'm going for a walk, my head is going to the right constantly because I'm always looking at what's there. I come back with a few flowers in my hand, or a few berries, or a stick for the fire. You know, there's so much in the hedges all the time, and that's just my local area. And it's for me, it's a really feel good feeling to get out and about in that kind of an area. I'll often have, you'll see on the right hand side there, my very old-fashioned and dirty looking secretaries and just an ordinary shopping bag. I don't have a fancy basket, but if I go out deciding, okay, today's the day I'm going to gather something or other to cook with, that's what I bring with me, because I can stuff the bag in my pocket and off I go, and I might find something or I might not. But I don't have a big cumbersome bucket or basket with me, and it's very easy to carry about, so I find that very handy. But before I go into talking about food at all, for me the hedges are so full of beauty. And I think with this COVID, this horrible 2 years we're after having, we really have started talking about our well-being and our mindfulness an awful lot more. And this is just an example of something that I've been doing lately, mandalas, which are basically just circles. And I just collect a very few little flowers and leaves. I don't have loads and loads, just a few different ones. And this is something really beautiful that you can do for yourself or with your children. If you have children, sitting down in a quiet area and just very mindfully and carefully choosing leaves and flowers and literally just arranging them in circles, and time will stand still. And it is completely beautiful exercise to get involved in, and it is such a de-stressor if it's all sorts of bad stuff is going on around you, and I would highly recommend it. And all of those are just little haws, little bits of honeysuckle from the fern, a little bit of clover there in the center, just little bits and pieces, foxglove here, that I found during the summer. And you just arrange, and you can arrange it, take your picture, and then you can just wipe it clean, which is part of the mindfulness as well. You know, there's a circle of life that we move on. And then you can start another completely different circle, arranging the flowers and leaves in a different way, and take another photograph of that if you want to capture the moment. It's just a really nice thing to do. Not food for the stomach, but food for our whole body and our mindfulness, which I think is very important. I have a couple of little recipes here. I just thought, right, well, let's do something very practical. And at the moment, certainly the rose hips are very well evident and very easy to find in the hedges. And you can see the image of them. They're lovely, big, plump ones, very red. And even for myself, I stuck up my Christmas tree the other day. The berries on the holly are getting a bit scarce. So I just put in a few little sprigs of rose hips here and there in the holly, and that'll just give the little burst of red. But in terms of food, I decided, let's see if rose hips, if I can make some shortbread and use rose hips as a flavoring, and it actually worked really well. So I have a very simple little recipe here. I'm not going to talk you through in any great detail, but in terms of the ingredients, you can see it's very simple. Just go for your lovely little walk beforehand and gather. I gathered about 80 grams of rose hips. You could get more if you wish. Little cold water, a bit of flour, butter, definitely butter, never margarine, icing sugar and corn flour as the basis for your little bit of the shortbread. And very simple to make. Just use a scissors to snip the rose hips off the branches. Quite big thorns on a rose hip, so just be careful of your fingers there. But it's a nice little job. Again, involving children in all of these exercises. You're building memories, you're doing something together, and you're sharing the whole experience. And I just think it's a nice thing to do. Excuse me. So once you've snipped your rose hips off the stalk, put them in a saucepan with the water and simmer for 30 minutes, and they'll really just, mush down and get very soft. Put them in a sieve and really press hard. All of those 80 grams of rose hips, you only really get about a teaspoon of the pulp, because a rose hip is full of seeds. So don't be disappointed. That's what you're expecting to get. Because if you're making shortbread and you're flavoring it with vanilla, you'd only be using a teaspoon of vanilla. So that's how it reduces down. And then just put everything in a food processor if you have it, or if you don't, put everything in a bowl and just rub in your butter very, very well until you just have your dough, and then roll it out. When you're rolling out your biscuits, don't go for the maximum number of biscuits. Have a nice thick dough and you'll get a nicer tasting biscuit with a nice snap on it. It kind of works better. Bake it for about 10-15 minutes at 100, or 10 or 12 minutes at 180 degrees. Really, really lovely, very delicate flavor, but it's just a nice idea that you're eating a biscuit that is flavored with rose hips, flavored with something natural, something free, something organic, something that you've collected yourself. And another interesting one that I made the other day was I decided I'd make a tomato sauce and I'd flavor it with the haws. I suppose similar looking to the rose hips, but I think most people are familiar with the haws. They're tiny little berries, very hard, not very pleasant to eat on their own. But when I put them into the tomato sauce, they gave a lovely, delicate again, but another layer of flavoring. And again, it's just a lovely idea to use your wild food in this way. So it's pretty much just an ordinary everyday tomato sauce. You have your tin of tomatoes, a little bit of garlic, a little bit of onion, salt, and a little bit of sugar. And then I actually cooked the haws in the cider vinegar just to give that extra layer of flavor. So in terms of making it, again, use the scissors to snip them off. It's just because in 100 grams of haws, there's quite a few haws. You need quite a few haws to make up that volume there. And then simmer them in the cider vinegar. So the cider vinegar will completely reduce down. So you're just left, keep an eye on it, but you just be left with pretty much the cooked haws in the bottom of the saucepan, and press them through the sieve. You get a bit more now this time than with the rose hips. And then just make up your tomato sauce the way you normally would. Finally chop your onion and garlic, cook it off, add your chopped tomatoes, your sugar and your haw puree. Allow that to simmer together for 10 minutes just to infuse all those flavors. And I use a stick blender then. I like to have a smooth sauce at the end. And that's just lovely on pasta. And I had it with gnocchi as well the other day, and really, really lovely. You know there's something different in the tomato sauce, but you can't really put your finger on what it is different, but it is a very pleasant taste. And the last one that I just thought I'd mention this time of the year is possibly a little bit late to make it in terms of people might be thinking, oh, slow gin for Christmas. You'd want to be thinking maybe a month or so ago. Very simple to make the slow gin, because really you're just using gin and sugar and sloes. The little tricky bit with making the gin is it's a bit tedious. You need to prick the sloes in several places with a sterilized needle. So that allows the gin in, allows the flavor in, or even if you like, allow the slow flavor out. And then you need to really put the whole lot into a sterilized jar for about a week or so. You shake it every day until the sugar is dissolved, and then leave it in a cool place for really 3 or 4 months until you get a good flavor. I'm still drinking that slow gin that's there. I'm not a big drinker, obviously, but I made that slow gin about 2 years ago. I'm still drinking that same slow gin, and it is lovely. And I mix it with ginger ale, and that's the way I like to drink that. But I don't drink it very much, but it is nice, and it's nice to make a mulled wine with it as well, adding it in to the mulled wine. The other little thing I thought that I would mention is, again, with the hedgerows, because they are so beautiful all times of the year. But towards the autumn and the winter time, there's other things that we can do apart from just flowers. And this is just a bit of broom that I picked the other day. And literally, I just tied it with a twine. I actually have it here behind me as well, into a heart shape. I like heart shapes, as you can see. That's a patchwork hanging I made there a while back. And I just thought, oh, that's nice. That suits me. That suits my style. I don't know what those flowers are. They're dried weeds of some kinds that I picked off the hedgerow. Possibly Mary might be able to identify them. But it's just such a nice, simple little thing. And in terms of decorating your dining space with something wild, going out and making that selection, again, involving the family in that, I think it's just a nice exercise, a nice thing to do. A very simple wreath. And, the circular pattern there, we're really reminded of the circle of life, circle of growth, maturity, dying back. That's all part of the natural cycle. So we're in the resting cycle now for winter, and hopefully we'll expect a lovely spring in another few months. So I just have that just made with ivy, just tied with natural twine, and I think it's beautiful as it is. And now this time of the year, I just insert the little ivy berries, and I don't go with the whole red and putting artificial things on that. I just leave it natural and let it be as it is. And for me, that's a nice thing about the hedgerows. I'm really respecting what is there in front of me and just taking a little, not taking a lot, leaving the vast majority of the berries for the birds, because that's really important. And just finally to finish up, I have some website there that I have some recipes on, thekitchendrawer.net, but you'll find recipes for these wild foods on that website. So love the wild garlic. Regina mentioned it earlier on. I make a wild garlic and potato soup, which is very nice. But I have a recipe here for scones, which is another different way of using it. Meadow sweet, the nice white fluffy flower that you find in the summertime in wet areas, not specifically a hedgerow plant, but I do find it in hedgerows from time to time. That makes a beautiful panna cotta, absolutely smashing. So well worth looking that up perhaps next summer when it's around. We're very familiar with the elderflower cordial, and look at it's for me, it's just, I do it every single year because it's a cyclical thing. It's like, oh gosh, here we are, end of May, June, this is that time, and it really sets me in the year. The bilberries Regina mentioned as well, those wild blueberries, there's absolutely intense flavor of them. They are just beautiful. Very tedious to collect any amount of them, so you definitely need to bring a few friends with you if you're collecting them, but well worth the effort. In the video you saw the rosehip syrup, so we use that as a drink and also a syrup over desserts. Crabapple jelly I make every year. I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful, that red intense color. Lovely gift to give to people. And the crabapple cheese, which is made with the pulp, and that can be spread on bread or used with cheese itself. It's actually very nice. And again, the blackberries, we're pretty familiar with blackberries, but they do make lovely muffins. And I think the mousse was in that video there. That is beautiful mousse, very simple to make. So I hope there's something there that people enjoy, and that, you know, you might have lots and lots of ideas of your own, but that's just a few of mine. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a million, Rosemary. Just
no problem.
Amazing there. Food for the mind as well as the stomach. I like that. And I think this will be followed on very, very similar, in a similar vein. Mary White from Blackstairs Eco Trails. Really looking forward to hearing about that. Mary, so if you just want to introduce yourself, and I'll put up the slide. I'm going to show a few pictures while Mary is talking.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Katherine and everyone at Teagasc. I'm delighted to be here to talk about my favourite passion, which is foraging, and also hedgerows, which I think are the most fantastic thing in the Irish countryside, and it worries me that they're disappearing. But there is a lot of emphasis now on protecting and preserving hedgerows, and I hope with the new CAP, when we know the details of that there will be support for farmers and landowners to protect hedgerows, because they are the essential backbone, I think, of our countryside. I run a gold accredited eco centre here at the foot of the Blackstairs Mountains since 2011. I'm a botanist and ecologist, and with my husband Robert and daughter Dorothy Ellen, we run the centre with foraging workshops, foraging hen parties, fungi workshops, and tree trails. So we have a very diverse offering for guests. And I think one of the biggest things is that as we drift towards a more urban society, people are losing their connection to their rural heritage. And Regina mentioned that very interestingly earlier on, of going back to the Celts, and there was a dira or a penalty if you cut down a noble of the woods like an oak or a Scots pine or a holly, because they were 3 of the 7 nobles. So people want to connect back to their countryside, back to memory and nostalgia, but also too, they're worried that their children are growing up in a more urban environment, and there's a disconnect between what is outside in the fields and the woods and the mountains, and what they're perhaps watching on television. For many years, I was a heritage expert, that's what they call us, with the Heritage Council, and going into schools. And children know more about dinosaurs and Siberian tigers than they do about maybe bilberries or blackberries. They do know, but they're terrified of getting stung by nettles and things like that. And it is my great pleasure to go into schools and bring children out and show them what they can do and make and eat and taste and enjoy in the wilds. So Katherine, maybe the first the little slide. I didn't want to produce a huge big PowerPoint because I knew our previous guests were going to do something fabulous, and they were fabulous. So my little shots here are, I was once asked to see could I find 50 wild safe foods in half an hour on our own land, and I'm delighted to say I managed it. Of course, I had to go around beforehand to make sure that everything was there. So this is just some of the wild food that I picked for that little test. The first little yellow bowl there, which normally has something else in it, it's lovely gorse flowers, and you can make beautiful gorse flower ice cream from the gorse flowers any time of the year. Now, they're very troublesome to pick because they're prickly, but it makes the most intense, coconutty, gorgeous ice cream, and very, very easy to make. If anyone wants any of these recipes, and I know Regina and Rosemarie have tons of them, but I'd be happy to share anything that I have myself. And the second little blue and white bowl on the left, as you look at the screen, is sorrel. And sorrel, of course, is wonderful and makes a wonderful sauce for fish. And at this time of the year, when there's very, very little outside, usually I try and eat something forage every single day, even a small wild green salad. And you can use the sorrel leaves, you can use dandelion leaves, most people know dandelion leaves, and hairy bitter cress. And hairy bitter cress isn't actually in that photograph, but it's a lovely peppery cress. And you can have a lovely little green salad, just a small plateful with some nice dressing and some homemade bread. And wow, that is just lovely. The little green dish with the black kind of looks like pepper. That is the seed pods of a wonderful plant which grows near monasteries and things like that. It's a member of the Umbellifera family, and it has a really incredible kind of cardamom smell, really incredible. You can put it into your pepper canister and grind it instead of ordinary pepper. It's absolutely lovely. To the right then you have wild watermint, and then further on then you have a little bit of nettles there in the white little pot there, nettles, and then moving on then you have a little bit of ground ivy, and ground ivy makes the most incredible veggie burgers, an intense flavor. You need to know what you're picking, obviously, and you know the motto is when you're foraging, when in doubt, leave it out, because you don't want to make yourself sick. The little Kilner jar with our little labels on it there, with the little purple label on it, doesn't look very attractive from this point of view, but it contains ash key. Ash keys are the seed pods of the ash, our wonderful ash, which sadly has got this awful disease now. But if you can get a healthy tree, and in the summertime, the keys, as they're known, they're like bunches of keys hanging down, lovely and green and soft, and that's the time to pick them. And you can make the most incredible pickle with that, lovely with cheese or cold meats or game, for whatever you like to use chutney or pickles for. But it is an amazing, absolutely amazing pickle, really lovely. Takes quite a long time to mature. Now, it's no good if you pick the keys and they're hard. You have to have them nice and soft. And then in the far corner, then there's a few little wild raspberries and a few little bilberries. So Katherine, if you wouldn't mind the next little slide. Now, this is the king or the queen of the forest, and it is a cep, a Boletus edulis, one of the most delicious and most sought after wild mushrooms. And we've had a fantastic mushroom season with our workshops this year, and people are fascinated by fungi. And it's not only the fruiting body, which you see there as the cep in French, or porcini in Italian, or Boletus edulis, its correct name, in Latin. But, you know, the stalk or the stipe there with the little kind of hat on top, which is known as a cap. And it is the most delicious mushroom that you can find. And it's worthwhile just staying a little while, that it is quite easy to distinguish it from other mushrooms. The stalk or the stipe is really solid. When you press it, it won't break. Really, really solid. The cap is that lovely penny brown color, and it always has that little white ridge around it. And underneath, the gills or the sponges will be white. And as it ages, they go kind of yellow. It's still okay to eat, but it grows beautifully in broadleaf woods. It loves growing under beech, and quite hard to find unless your eye is trained to what's on the forest floor. But a walk along a hedgerow containing beech or Scots pine or rowans or birch or larch. You know, a lot of our ditches here in Kiledmont under the Blackstairs, we have, you know, a big area of hedges. I'm sure my farming neighbours are very distressed how bushy they are, but they are providing the most incredible shelter for wildlife, the most incredible food for foraging and for birds at this time of the year. Lots of hips and haws and delicious things for our Scandinavian migrant birds, which are coming in now, like fieldfares and red wings. And these, of course, mushrooms, which the season is over now, because once you get the first frost, that's it. But you know, when you start foraging and when you sort of get interested to see what's on your doorstep, not just in the rural areas, but you know, industrial foraging or urban foraging can be as exciting. And I've taken teachers for the Department of Education out on an industrial forage to see what we can find in Bagnallstown or Winnabeog in County Carlow. And you wouldn't believe what we found up at Irish Rail Station or on the pavements. Now, I'm not saying we would eat everything, because you might have dogs or cats or whatever fouling the food. And the old adage is, never pick anything that's lower than the hind leg of an Alsatian, and you can work that one out for yourself. You want to make sure that you're eating things that are clean and free from pollution. The next slide, please, Katherine. This is one of our workshops on a lovely day. It started off raining. It's just, you can see the bit of a mountain there is the slope of Mount Leinster. And this is a lovely hedgerow, and it was an incredible crop of blackberries. And some of the people who came on that walk had never actually picked blackberries. They came from different countries. They had different, you know, origins of how they were brought up. Maybe we're in big cities, or some people from New York who lived on the 64th floor of an apartment block opposite the UN building. And for them to come out and go into the countryside and pick blackberries, put them into their little baskets, bring them home and make blackberry ice cream. We did a demonstration that day, blackberry ice cream or blackberry and apple crumble or blackberry sorbet, whatever we were doing. They were mesmerized. It doesn't have to be something fancy like truffles or something very sort of highfalutin or tricky to make. It's that nostalgia of picking and foraging that is so important from our hedgerows. In fact, it's in our DNA to forage. We were born foragers. There was no Lidl or Aldi or SuperValu or Dunnes stores when our ancestors, the Celts, were roaming the countryside, and all we had was a vastly forested country with a lot of boar and deer and hedgerows and huge trees, and they foraged, because you just didn't wait for the shops to open at 9 o'clock and close at 9 o'clock at night. You had to go out and forage, and then you had to know what to do with the food that came back for you. So this was an example, a very simple example of people enjoying themselves, picking something and then bringing it back to our centre and making it into something delicious and eating it, and hopefully sparking an interest in what is the rich hedgerow biodiversity that is all throughout Ireland, and indeed in many other parts of Europe as well. But I think in Ireland particularly, England is losing that heritage. We have these linear fields with minimal hedges, and also too in Italy and France. But in Ireland, we have this rich biodiversity where hedges like can throw up the sloes, the fungi, the hawthorn, and the larch, beech. We can eat the beech nuts. You can eat the beech leaves in the early spring. They're absolutely lovely when the little lime green leaves have the little hairy bits on the outside and they're feathery. You can eat them, put them in sandwiches. You can also eat the hawthorn leaves. They were known as bread and cheese. You just put them into 2 slabs of bread, and put some cheese and your hawthorn leaves. Again, the hawthorn leaves when they're very soft, because when they get older, they get a bit more leathery. Next one, please, Katherine. This is myself and Paul Flynn. Paul Flynn is featuring well today, but I had the great pleasure of doing Lords and Ladles here with Burris House, and Paul Flynn was sent out to forage with me, and we had a fantastic time foraging and cooking up. And this is a nice wild green salad with green alkanet flowers. That's the middle photograph on the right. And the top one is Paul's hand with the Alexander seeds. And Alexander is that member of the Umbelliferae family that I said that you could use instead of the ordinary peppercorns, you can use Alexander seeds. And it is an exquisite taste, absolutely exquisite taste. Indeed, some artisan chocolate makers have asked me, would I supply them with Alexander seeds? But we're not commercial foragers at all. We just want to show people the richness of our hedges, the richness of our meadows, the wonderful wild foods that are there, that are part, as I said, of our history and our DNA and our Celtic backgrounds. And the monks were wonderful people for using Alexanders. And you will find today, if you poke around a lot of old monasteries, which I do from time to time, that the Alexanders are growing there. And you can also steam the stalks of Alexanders. It's known as the poor man's asparagus. And you steam them and it goes a beautiful, glorious green color, kind of lime green color. And you put a blob of butter on it and some lovely pepper and eat it. And you could hardly distinguish it from asparagus. And a lot of asparagus now is flown in from Peru, which is fine, but it's air miles. And I hope the people who grow it get a amount of money for producing it. But people in Ireland grow asparagus. We grow it ourselves, and it is a fantastic food to have. But the stalks of the Alexander are equally good. Down below, Paul's hand and my hand, the last little one on the right, are the stalks of hogweed. Now, hogweed is a member of the Umbellifera family again, and it has some very toxic relations like hemlock and giant hogweed. So you've got to be careful of make sure that you know your plants well. These are the seed heads that have gone off, and they're nice and brown, and you can make wonderful hogweed seed cookies. And I once had the great honor of bringing some down to Ballyfin House Hotel, which is a very wonderful hotel. They were trying to do something with foraging, and I brought down my homemade hogweed seed cookies with my little cutter like Rosemary's there, and I did my very best with them, and we ate them there with the chefs in Ballyfin, and they were delighted with them, and they were going to hopefully reproduce them for their guests. I don't know whether they ever did, but I brought down the sample, and that's the little seed head there. Delicious, delicious flavor, wonderful cardamom flavor. But you've got to be careful with the Umbellifera because some of them are very toxic, like the hemlock and like giant hogweed, which will give you a terrible rash on your hand. Katherine, is that the end of my slides?
That's it.
That's it. Just a brief gallop through the hedgerows and how important they are. And my wish is that children now in primary school and all the way through secondary school, they would have time out from their classes to get out and forage and sample and taste and do a bit of practical cooking, because they're the next generation and they have to guard the seed heritage and the wonderful biodiversity that we have now. They're the next generation. So the motto is get them out in the fields, get them cooking, get them interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. So I failed to introduce at the start, but I shall now do so. Pat Murphy, who is the head of the Environment KT program, our boss here. And Pat is going to take it away from here, and we'll invite Mary, Rosemary and Regina to turn on your cameras and field the questions. Thank you, Pat.
Okay, good number of questions coming in. Plenty of room for more, so keep them coming. There's a question here. Regina refers to reduced status of food over recent generations. Could this help explain the current fashion for neat and tidy and over-managed hedgerows rather than the big bushy ones? And I suppose that the question is about our perception of what can come from the hedges, and if that perception was changed, might it help change that management? Regina, yeah.
Gosh, that's a very big question, Pat, which takes a very micro example of a hedgerow and the foods from the hedgerow. But really, I suppose it's a macro issue really as to how food systems have been changing, and the hedgerows would come into those greater changes in terms of people's relationship with food, food systems, food chains, where people are accessing food, why they're accessing food in certain places, and so on. So it is really a kind of a huge question to answer. I think just, to make very big, broad stroke answers to those kind of questions, I think as you kind of move through time, and especially as people become more food consumers, that they're not actually connected with food production or the source of food, as people become more food consumers and they're accessing foods through other routes, the relationship between wild foods is either broken or another value system is set up between what you can get for free or what you can buy. And in many instances, what we buy, now this is changing, which I think is really good. Sometimes what we buy we think is greater value than what we can get for free. And within the context of free, you'll find all the hedgerows, the hedgerow foods, the woodland foods, the other environments as well. So they're all in the free area. And I suppose in this kind of capitalist kind of way of operation, those things have inferior value, which is really very, very unfortunate. So I think that to answer that question, you need to go to all different places. So that's as I say, that's my very broad stroke response to that question.
Do any of the others want to come in on that? And I have a kind of a related question in relation to sorry, Mary.
Yeah, well, I hope we're losing our mania for tidiness. I have big, wild, straggly hedges, and I know, and I love my neighbours dearly, but they might be thinking, what is she doing in there? And, the hedge is creeping out a good bit, but the number of species that I have there, and the bewildering source of wild food and energy for biodiversity itself, not alone for people who might come to us and forage a bit. And we always make very sure, a third for wildlife, a third we might take. In fact, we never take a third, and a third for sustainability. But I think, it's a mania. It's like mowing your lawn. Your neighbors might sniff at you if you don't mow your lawn. But when you let your lawn bloom, look what comes up. Wild herbs and flowers and amazing things. And the bees and everything like that love the nectar and the pollen. So I think we have to get a little bit more untidy and not to be so, conformist about how everything has to be in a straight line. And that will take a while. But I think, as I said before, my hope is in the new CAP that there will be greater recognition for big, untidy, blousy hedges, which are supporting animals on one side from wind and rain and snow and storms, and supporting wildlife inside and giving us immense pleasure all year round, even though they look a bit, blousy.
And I suppose the follow-on question from that is what do we need to do to manage hedgerows or unmanage them, as the case may be, to get those kind of results?
Well, I think I have to just jump in there quickly. I won't hog the time, but I think you have to manage your hedge. You have to make sure that it's thick from the bottom and not just getting very leggy and big gaps in it. And that's a skill in itself. I mean, hedge laying was a tremendous art, particularly with our neighbour, the United Kingdom. But we weren't so good at it here. But there are hedge laying courses now, and I think you definitely have to cut your hedge down and make it nice and thick and weatherproof, stockproof, and full of biodiversity. You just can't let it grow wild. I don't mean that. You have to actually cut the top off, make sure that the gaps maybe you have to plant in between. So there is a bit of skill and management in it. It's not just saying, well, I'm not going to cut my hedge, because it'll get weaker and leggier as it grows up. And there are people out there, particularly people like Liam Lycett from the National Biodiversity Centre down there, who's very good on that. In fact, we had him out here in Culebron for a hedgerow walk to see how best to manage hedges. And there are other people as well, I'm sure, in your own organisation, Teagasc, who would be well able to support the notion of not cutting hedges back so much.
A question here in relation to, and I think it could kind of speak to a lot of people, and it's just saying what hedgerow plants should we avoid picking and to make sure to stay safe. So I think it might kind of address an issue that a lot of people are a little bit afraid of what's out there and not being able to differentiate the great from the nasty.
I think I'm waiting for Mary to answer that, because she seems so knowledgeable. I think for me, certainly, we keep there's great confidence in what we know, and like we're very familiar with blackberries. That's been well mentioned this morning, and you know, those other berries that we feel very familiar with. But then there's other ones that we feel, oh gosh, really anxious about, and it's important to have a little bit of fear, if you like, and not be over enthusiastic about trying everything. But certainly Mary might have some further information about the really no-go ones.
Yeah, well, I think you don't have to go too far. I mean, you can get plants now for a native hedgerow in most good garden centres. You know, things like hawthorn and blackthorn, I mean, they're the kind of staples. And then you have the blackberries, and it's to balance the leggy with the kind of bushy. So the blackberries will grow kind of, you know, horizontally. The hawthorn will go, you know, the other way, and so will the sloes. So you can have blackthorn and hawthorn, and a lot of people don't know the difference between those. The hawthorn, known as the May, and the leaves come first there, and then the beautiful white blossom, the May blossom. And then the blackthorn, the blossom is also white, but it comes before the leaves, and it's got very, very spiny thorns that can give you a good old dart if you're picking sloes. But they make a fantastic hedge, you know, hawthorn, blackthorn, and blackberry. And then you could put in things like, well, you know, you could put in rowans and things like that, and they grow quite slow. Hazel, of course. Hazel is a wonderful, one of the noble trees of the Celts, and of course gives you lovely nuts and everything, and the wonderful stays for making barricades to keep your enemies out and your animals in. So the hazel would be very good again. And then coppiced, the hazel being coppiced with the hawthorn and the blackthorn, would make a fantastic hedge. And that you can buy bundles of hawthorn or bundles of sloes, and for quite reasonable prices. There was a very interesting man called Hooper in Britain, and he devised a method of dating your hedge. And I'll just quote from it. And he said, the number of woody plant species in a 30-yard section, and you multiply that by 110, and it'll give you an approximate age. And he was head of plant psychology and ecology in England, a very brilliant man. It's known as Hooper's Law. So you can actually then date your hedge. I mean, some of us have very old hedges. I mean, our hedges are, you know, well over 1,000 years old if you do Hooper's Law methodology and measuring it. And they're very broad, you know, you wouldn't jump over them. And, or if you're on a horse, you wouldn't jump over them. I mean, they're, you know, maybe 5 meters wide at the top. So, I mean, that's a good hedge. And, but that's a method of measuring it. But I think anybody shouldn't be daunted by, oh, what am I going to do? Just go and get some, if you haven't, even if you have an urban garden, put in a lovely native hedge, and you'll find birds coming, and you'll find wonderful berries and fruits coming on that with blackthorn, hawthorn. Then there's guelder rose, and there's all sorts of wonderful things you can get for your hedgerow. And a good nursery, rather than a lifestyle centre, a really good plant nursery will be able to lead you in the right direction there.
Question there, what can councils and public educators do in practical terms to reconnect people with wild foods?
I just come back in there to kind of come in to that question, but also kind of layer it over the last question as well. I suppose the first, like again, that this is a kind of a whole process, I suppose, of almost reintroducing people to this whole world. And what I would suggest is that maybe start with what you know first, and build it gradually. There are some really excellent publications now which will guide you through what's available and what's good to eat and what to avoid. And those publications are fantastic because the production values of them are so high that they're very good for recognition and for recognizing. So I would think about, first of all, and maybe have a willingness to engage in the activity, go with what you know, and maybe slowly build that knowledge bank. For lots of things, I think, and this kind of runs into the next question, Pat, that you just posed there, a lot of this is based on education. So you have to think very cleverly of how to engage people to be willing to take on sort of new information. And starting, I think, with children is a fantastic idea because they love this. This is an adventure. It's an adventure because it's so outside the conventions of their food at the moment. So this is opening up, it's like a fairy tale. It's opening up a different world that you go and you engage in a very kind of, not just knowledge and cognition, but you engage on a tacit level whereby you can look and you can touch and you can feel, and then of course you can bring it back home and eat it. So it's a whole kind of package of engagement. And if you have really attractive, well thought out education systems for children, I think you're onto a winner, and you can't fail in this regard. And again, that's another building, because you're investing, I suppose, because this is a whole sea change in thinking. It's a different world view. We have to appreciate that. We're all here together as interested parties, but the challenge is to how to bring more people in to be interested in a very manageable way that respects all of the different environments and so on. So I think education is the key, whether you take it on yourself or whether it's more, systematic and you're reaching out to children and building that knowledge bank as you go through time with in mind the results that will come from that will benefit all of us, I suppose.
And just building on that, Regina, I mean, every single person here who's a parent, whatever you do, if you're just going for that walk and you're just identifying plants, or you're picking the few things and bringing them back and making memories, cooking with your children, I'm a huge advocate of that, as you can probably guess, and enjoying things together, sitting down and trying things, and it's so exciting, and children just love it, and it's a game changer as a family event rather than going to town or whatever the other options are, and COVID wise, perfectly safe. So hopefully people will give it a go.
Well, there's a huge number of compliments coming in for the talk and your contributions. And a question there in relation to the role of a number of professionals who have made, I suppose, a profession out of foraging and helping people to understand the countryside and what's out there. And a question is it something where there is scope for a significant number of other people to make an enterprise from? Maybe you don't want the competition, Mary, but
no, I think absolutely. I think the more people connect with their local area, and the more interested they are, and there's room for everybody. We certainly in the spring and summer and autumn months, we would get dozens of people saying, "I'd like to do what you do," and I'd say, "Fantastic, do it." And then we get other people who came on one of our foraging courses, and then I happened to be online one day and I saw somebody offering foraging courses, and you can't open up foraging if you've only done one foraging course. You need to know your plants, your seeds, your leaves, and if you eat something and if you're demonstrating something and you're a public place, you've got to be careful. Your liabilities are enormous. But I would say there's oodles of opportunities for people to develop places like ours, Blackstairs Eco Centre, and other places like Rosemary's, and Regina with her academic knowledge, There's fantastic different ways of doing it. Maybe I could just say the most interesting thing that ever happened to me since we opened our centre in 2011 was when we had a school here. And we always have, as Rosemarie said, kids love getting out of the classroom. They love being outdoors, and the parents like to know they're having a nice time in a, outdoors in a safe, interesting environment. And this was a deaf school, a difficult school, and I was warned that maybe, I'd have a bit of trouble with these kids. I've never had trouble with kids when they're outdoors. They absolutely love it. They don't want to go home on the bus. This guy, he had outgrown his strength of his peers. He was much taller than them. He was seriously overweight and a lot of problems. And he didn't say a word for the whole day, not a word for the whole day. And they came at 11 and they went at 2 o'clock or something to get back to school for 3. And the teacher said, anyone want to ask Mary a question? And everyone said, oh no, they'd had a great day and they were on the bus and they were eating the remains of their lunch and things like that. And this guy put up his hand, and the teacher was mesmerized, and he said, yes, do you want to ask a question? And he said, how can I be her? And something sparked in that boy. And he is now a wildlife biologist. He did a course in Tralee IT. He came here and he did work placement for me. I didn't pay him. He just, did work placement. And that was somebody who would normally mitch from school. And that day he just happened to be there and hopped on the bus with the rest of them. And out of that kind of, sad morass of his, personal life was difficult. This boy went to the library, lost weight, took up running, applied himself, and is now a wildlife biologist working in Canada. So that is incredible that he happened to turn up that day and he found something that he could relate to in the wild. He didn't have to sit down in an academic setting. He could learn about the plants. He could learn about animal footprints. He could learn about how to treat animals and how to learn the structure of animals. And now he's got a job in some wildlife place in Canada outside Toronto. So chance. But children really, they are the fountain of knowledge for the future, and we've got to cultivate it in a non-preachy, non-kind of fussy way. It's fantastic if you can get out there and do it. So the long-winded answer to Pat, yes, more and more people should be doing it and opening up centres and enjoying what we have. This is a fantastic country, despite all the problems of COVID and banking crashes and everything else. If you go to other countries, you always want to come home, and home is a fantastic country, our little planet. We've got to look after it.
Katherine, I don't think I could ask for a better finish than that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Pat. Just to mention the webinar tomorrow, Pat, maybe you'll do that and then I'll
Yep.
thank the guests.
Yes, tomorrow at 9:30. Oh, sorry, I just lost my place here. Yeah, we have the value of native provenance trees and hedging stock, and it's Joe Gowran, CEO of Woodlands of Ireland, and Maria Cullen, who is chair of the Society of Irish Plant Pathologists, will be joining us tomorrow morning at 9:30.
And just to remind people on this webinar that you need to join the normal signpost webinar. You have had possibly had the links for this week, but you do need to register specifically for that. Okay. And I just really want to thank my colleagues Yvonne and Pat, but the 3 star speakers and the fantastic contribution which I've learned from, and I hope to push out your messages. I suppose that's my role in life, but thank you very much to Regina, Rosemarie and Mary. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.